Good evening. Welcome to the February 12th, 2019 Lawrence City Commission meeting. Could somebody grab that door and shut that, please?
I remind people to turn their cell phones down too, please.
Off. So I'm going to start the meeting tonight with a special announcement. Starting on Monday, February 25th, Municipal Court, which includes the City Prosecutor's Office and the Human Relations Office, will permanently move from its current location at 1006 New Hampshire to the top floor of the new City Hall Riverfront at 1 Riverfront Plaza, just east of City Hall. The first court session in the new location is set for Monday, February 25th, 2019. Also on Monday, February 25th, the Lawrence Douglas County Planning and Development Services Department will move to their new offices in the new City Hall Riverfront office space next to Municipal Court. For more information about Municipal Court, you can call 785-832-6190. And for more information about the Planning and Development Services Department, you can call 785-832-7700. Thank you. So the first item we have is are a couple of proclamations, and we're going to switch this up a little bit. Our schedule shows to have the V&A one first, but we're going to switch it up to have the African American History Month proclamation first, because the gentleman's got to leave.
Thank you. Just a second, let me make a spot here. Yeah, so I just want to give a brief preface to the city's Black History Month, African American History Month proclamation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Because I'm not going to lean down with this little guy. From its modest beginnings in 1926 as Negro History Week, through its post-civil rights era expansion in 1976, to its current recognition as a national moment of reflection and conversation, African American History Month has been an opportunity for Americans to acknowledge the historical truths of the Black experience in this country, and in some measure to recognize those of us that have, through adversity, managed to make an indelible mark on the national timeline. And in that capacity, the holiday is appreciated. However, today I would like to assert that an acknowledgement alone is not enough if the goal is indeed to fulfill the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all Americans. Black history is too often painted in black and white, or whitewashed, both actively and inadvertently, by inaccuracies, and as well as emotionally neutralized through a pervasive wave of mainstream manipulation and homogenization. In the face of these sorts of cultural infringements, we must actively fight to move the understanding of Black history forward once again. Because to us, the stories of Black history are not simply conveniently resolved stories from books and TV or academic exercises. There are living links to each other, ones that survived hundreds of years of sustained and precise attacks. They are the continuance of a narrative that includes not only our immediate and extended family trees, but also the birth of humanity itself. My great-grandmother lived to be 104 years old. At the time of her passing, there were 5 generations of my family occupying the same moment in time. We called her Mother Wood. She was strong, she was fierce, she was independent, and a conversationalist of the highest order, as was her mother and her mother's mother. When I was younger, Mother Wood told me stories of her childhood in the rural South. Some of them were light and full of joy, but many of them were cheerless chronicles of slavery as told to her by her mother. In one of them, Mother Wood conjured the life of her own grandmother, who, along with many other slaves, worked in the fields in the shadeless summer sun, and under constant gaze of an overseer that gleefully whipped them from horseback for the smallest perceived infraction or disrespect. Even with this constant threat, these slaves were so hungry that they often tried to sneak bites of the grain they were harvesting so that they would have the strength to keep working. In response to this, Mother Wood's grandmother and her slave family were put in iron helmets. These helmets made it impossible for them to put the grain in their mouths. The helmets were so heavy that they made working even more torturous. And the helmets got so hot in the sun that they burned the skin on the necks of those that wore them. Today, on the banks of the Ohio River near my hometown, there still stands the Baptist church that Mother Wood and her family attended. The same church my grandmother worshiped with her where she worshiped with her 4 children. In that church, beneath the floorboards of the room that my own mother went to Sunday school as a child, there was a cellar. And in the darkness and dirt of the northeast corner of that cellar were found slave shoes, clothes, lanterns, and broken shackles left behind as these people made their way north on the Underground Railroad. This is Black history. But more to the point, this is my family story, one that exists in spite of, not as a result of the American dream. The American dream was never meant for Black people of the African diaspora. As outlined in the founding documents of this country, it was meant for wealthy, landowning white men. Not Native people, not women, and certainly not slaves or their descendants. Such an extension of liberty and freedom would undercut the very praxis upon which the economic destiny of America was built. And I'm not saying these things to you today in an attempt to provoke pity or shame. To do so would, I believe, incite the very sort of reactive guilt and defensiveness that sabotages the constructive conversations between marginalized people and mainstream white America all day, every day, from sea to shining sea. If it chooses to look history square in the face, the confrontation, unpacking, and resolution of that generational guilt is the work of mainstream white America to do on its own. Instead, I'm saying these things to remind everyone in this room and beyond that the history of Black America is living and real in our daily lives. And as such, its scope can and must be allowed to bloom and infinitely scale in both directions and in proportion to the challenges we face. African American history is not that of a conquered people. It is that of a captured people. Our history did not begin with slavery. Our history was interrupted by slavery. Our ties to our culture were intentionally severed as a way to destroy our spirit and strategically snuff out ancestral wisdom. We survived a genocide of which there are no historical parallels. 5 Africans died for every one that survived the Middle Passage to America. That's 60 million people. People, not slaves. Mothers, fathers, children, carpenters, metal workers, healers, artists, musicians, hunters, historians, philosophers. That's who were on those boats. My family. People that looked like Mother Wood. People that looked like my grandmother and my mother. People that looked like me. People that looked like my children. Yes, there were victories. There was Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. There was Dorothy Height and May Mallory. There was W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin. And if right now you're wondering why I didn't mention Dr. King and Malcolm X, it's because sometimes I find it difficult to regard their lives as success stories. They were murdered. To me, a greater success would be that they were allowed to live, that they both could still be here alive today. So for every success, there were thousands of casualties. For every achievement, there were millions for whom achievement is out of reach. For every moment of joy, there are decades of generational trauma. And the people holding that trauma are here with us today. They are us, and we walk among you. And along with these stories, we also carry the burden of their dreams deferred. An existential sadness that can sometimes, for me, feel overwhelming. But we are not victims. We are simply Americans asserting our humanity in a country that seems determined to invalidate it. The story of Black America is the story of America itself, and a comprehensive understanding of this country cannot exist without embracing it as an inextricable core element. Black history is not an elective. It must be woven into our national discourse from birth. Every struggle that haunts modern-day America is but a ghost of injustices past. Decent education, affordable health care and housing access, employment and compensation, environmental consequences, the prison industrial complex, LGBTQ issues, homelessness, and on. Every one of these issues disproportionately affects Black people, and that fact has not been fully reconciled. If we want to right these wrongs as Lawrencians and citizens of this country, and to continue walking the rocky path towards equality, we first need to stop saying we don't see race, or that we live in a post-racial society. Doing so is in itself an injustice and an erasure of colossal proportions. Saying you don't see race is to ignore the problems associated with race that Black people face every day, and in effect, to absolve oneself of any complicity in that injustice. Telling a Black person you don't see race is telling them that they are invisible. So for this African American History Month, I would encourage Lawrence to stop being not racist and start being actively anti-racist. Expand the possibilities of your involvement with Black culture and imagine what you might contribute to the Black liberation struggle. Become a creative and reliable ally in local shared equity goals. Let's start looking into the shadows of our homes, offices, networks, schools, organizations, friendships, businesses, and churches for ways to extract and correct racial and cultural inequalities. And let's make it last all year, not just 1 month. I want you to stop being inclusive and accepting of Black people and Black culture, and instead start celebrating it. I want you to seek it out like it's a missing piece of yourself. I want you to rejoice in the opportunity to begin offering a new and powerful experience to all Black people in your lives, the experience of truly being seen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll read the proclamation now. Whereas in the year 1619, a Dutch trading ship sailed into Chesapeake Bay and dropped anchor at Point Comfort, Virginia, marking the beginning of the unscrupulous slave trade in the American colonies. And whereas it was from this immoral origin and through inhuman conditions, discrimination, and prolonged hardship that emerged the vibrant culture, the singular accomplishments, and the groundbreaking triumphs that we honor and celebrate during National African American History Month. And whereas the National African American History Month is an occasion to rediscover the enduring stories of African Americans and the gifts of freedom, purpose, and opportunity they have bestowed on future generations. And whereas this year's theme, Black Migrations, highlights the challenges and the successes of African Americans as they moved from farms in the agricultural South to centers of industry in the North, Midwest, and West, especially the migrations that occurred in the 20th century. And whereas National African American History Month is a call to each and every citizen to reflect on the cultural, scientific, political, and economic contributions of African Americans, which are woven throughout American society. Now, therefore, I, Lisa Larson, Mayor of the City of Lawrence, Kansas, do hereby proclaim the month of February 2019 as National African American Month. Thank you. right, the second proclamation we have is with the proclaiming the month of February 2019 as Douglas County Visiting Nurses Association 50th anniversary.
See if I can make this pin work. Aha. Good evening. I'm Cynthia Lewis. I'm the CEO of Douglas County Visiting Nurses, and it's a really exciting time to be here with all of you this evening. The seed of Douglas County VNA was planted by a nurse who moved here with her family, whose husband was a KU professor in the 1960s, and one of her neighbors, Ralph Reed, who was a physician, founded Reed Medical Group. They worked together to start raising money and championing physicians to begin home care in Lawrence and Douglas County. In the very early days, most of our care was provided to citizens of Lawrence, and today more than 80% of our patients are City of Lawrence residents. So really appreciate the opportunity to celebrate this with you. The other thing I want to mention is we enjoy the opportunity to reside in the community health facility, and we're celebrating our 20th year. So that building was built, for most of you probably recall, with a sales tax referendum in 1999, and in August of this year we celebrate our 20th anniversary there. So it's a very big year for VNA. So thank you for recognizing our 50th anniversary.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll go ahead and read the proclamation now. Whereas the roots of Douglas County Visiting Nurses Association began in 1968 through the vision of Lynn Rothwell, RN, to bring home care to Lawrence, Kansas, Lynn worked with Dr. Ralph Reed, the Honorable Fred Six, and innumerable other community leaders to launch her dream. And with much perseverance, Lynn's vision was first realized on February 2nd, 1969. And whereas a committed staff of four registered nurses, 1 physical therapist, and 4 aides provided more than 2,600 visits to 89 patients in the VNA's first year. And whereas VNA has evolved to include hospice care and other in-home support services and technologies to meet the changing needs of our community. And in 2018, staff and volunteers across VNA programs were responsible for caring for nearly 1,700 residents of Lawrence and Douglas County. And whereas over the course of its 50-year history to Lawrence and Douglas County, VNA has served nearly 40,000 individuals with more than 1.6 million visits. Now, therefore, I, Lisa Larson, Mayor of the City of Lawrence, Kansas, do hereby proclaim the month of February 2019 as the Douglas County VNA 50th Anniversary Month. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. On to item B on our on the consent agenda. Note that all matters listed below on the consent agenda are considered under one motion and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on these items. If discussion is desired, that item will be removed from the consent agenda and will be considered separately. Members of the public wishing to speak to an item that has been pulled off the consent agenda will be limited to 3 minutes for comments. Is there anybody in the commission who wants to pull an item?
Number 8, please.
Number 8. Anybody else? Number 8. All right. So do I have a motion?
Public.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Is there anybody in the public that wants to have anything removed from the consent agenda? Anybody? Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mike.
I would move then we adopt the consent agenda and all claims with the exception of number 8.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Herbert and a second by Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
Second? I mean, that's it. Unanimous. Yeah, I'm
Yep.
sorry.
There we go.
I lost count. So item 8.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I'm inclined to be in favor of this item, but I'm concerned that we're not doing enough with it. So I'd like to hear from staff about what the plan is, if we have any plan for a corridor plan as opposed to just the bridge to the east boundary. I'm interested in the corridor from Iowa Street on over, so. Anybody speak to a corridor plan?
Sure. So in May of 2018, the MPO took the opportunity to apply to KDOT for 3 grants for competitive consolidated planning grant funding. This was one of 3 projects that we proposed as after a conversation with the MPO Technical Advisory Committee based on all of the region's inputs to the planning needs we had in the region. At the time, Chuck Souls identified the 23rd Street corridor that they were getting ready to budget in a CIP for 2020 and 2021 for design and construction of basically the Haskell Bridge to the east. So based on the scope of our ability to leverage federal money to do some of the design and planning work around that corridor based on what that planning grant funding can pay for before design, we built a project around helping leverage federal resources to do something that we were already going to have to do with local resources and hopefully bring some more bang for our buck to that project with that. For the remaining section of the corridor, all of the corridor, basically from Iowa to the eastern city limits, there was a corridor study done in 2002. And so many of the improvements as recommendations listed in that corridor study have been implemented over time, in addition to an additional access management planning that has been done and implemented with additional incentive money from KDOT at the time when 23rd Street served as K10 before the west leg was finished. And before the east leg was finished. That funding is no longer available, although the access management plan that we have for that corridor is still being pursued as development opportunities arise along the section between Iowa and Haskell, or for the whole corridor. The remaining part of the corridor stands, although there are no projects planned in the CIP in the out years for other sections of the project. And we had a conversation with staff at the Technical Advisory Committee level that to scope the planning project to best accommodate the design work that was budgeted in the CIP was most appropriate, especially because we didn't perceive any additional, since we've done mostly reconstruction of all the others, the mill and overlays on the rest of that other section of 23rd Street and the most recent project we're working on now between Mass and Louisiana. We didn't see an opportunity to do a plan for the whole corridor in a sense that would sit on the shelf without before another 10 years maybe of budgeting improvements.
I guess my concern is more in the land use area because of the changes we're seeing in land use with the decreased traffic on 23rd Street. You know, I'm looking at perhaps some suboptimal uses of the properties now. There are stores that are leaving 23rd Street, restaurants closing, and I'm concerned that we need to have a better overall picture, not just of the access management, but also of what we expect from this corridor and the neighborhoods that are on each side of it.
Yeah, and at this time, that type of scope of work is outside of the work plan that was applied to for KDOT and what received.
And I understand that. My question is, what do we have planned to do this? Because it's important for us to do it, and the need is now.
I would have to, I don't know that any other work has been discussed.
Yeah. We haven't discussed any other work or any other plans. We are going to get traffic counts on this corridor from Iowa to the Haskell Bridge. So we are extending some of the, doing a travel time study and getting traffic counts all the way to Iowa, but nothing with changes of land use.
Well, I mean, we're experiencing these changes, and the neighborhoods are in the process of being affected. So I guess my advice to staff would be, and I'd offer the opportunity to my fellow commissioners to weigh in on this, that we need to probably budget this year for some work on this next year, because that's about the soonest we can do it. And I you know, just as we're doing a downtown study, I think 23rd Street merits a similar study. So with that, unless somebody has other comment.
So it would be with the idea of trying to look at repurposing property or reuse of
Well,
property?
you know, an example that's happening, you know, I've read in the paper about a commercial, mixed-use commercial residential project that's right on 23rd Street at Naismith. I mean, these things are happening, and you know, I think it's important for us to recognize that this is going to have an impact on the neighborhoods, too. You know, there are neighborhoods up and down that corridor, and, you know, I think the city needs to have some idea of what we'd like to see as this is redeveloped.
Mayor, if I may interject, you know, we've got Plan 2040 coming up for discussion here very soon with the city commission. Out of that plan, I think we're going to see a need for, to get back into some of our sector plans and neighborhood plans. I don't disagree that this is involving a corridor of the community, but it is a much larger question and effort than the budget we had captured.
And
through the
I
grant.
concur with that.
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying I'd like to see something in the
Yeah.
budget
So
for
I think-
2020 for this kind of study.
Sure, and we also have some neighborhoods who have asked to participate in some planning efforts. So I think it's a matter of kind of prioritizing what those efforts can be and then deciding whether or not it's done in-house or we go out to consult
Right.
for some of those efforts. So,
Thank you.
All right, any other
Public comment.
public comment on this issue, item? Any public comment? Michael?
And Mayor, as Michael prepares himself, I would also just add that we are going to pay attention to land use with this study to the extent that we can here, but it's not clearly Commissioner Bowley intended or will get at every issue.
I believe I read land use in the documents.
Yes, yeah, and that's why I wanted to mention that, because we are going to pay attention to it to the point that we can in this.
Yeah.
Good evening, Mayor Larson and Commissioners. My name is Michael Allman. Yeah, I would concur with Mr. Bowley about the importance of the corridor from Iowa to, like, Haskell in this case, considering that the development that he mentioned at Naismith is a smart growth, smart code development. And I don't know what kind of directions or, right now, it's an optional code that developers, to this point, have never chosen before, so it's their choice. Is there some way that we can consider land use along that corridor that would somehow incentivize them to use that kind of a code instead of the normal development code? And that might make the properties more attractive and more community-based. So, other than that, the area that is part of the study by Olson and Associates, east of the bridge at Haskell, that is an area that the 19th Street Neighborhoods Coalition has mentioned before, that we would be very interested in that the motor vehicle constraints or whatever motor vehicle designs are developed in that corridor not create additional pressure for motor vehicles on 19th Street. That's basically what our concern is, that it not push more congestion on a 19th Street, whatever that might be. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Any other public comment on this item? Okay, bring it back up to the commission.
I move to authorize the city manager to execute a professional services agreements for the 23rd Street multimodal corridor study with Olson Incorporated.
Second.
So I have a motion by Commissioner Bowley, a second by Commissioner Arnona. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That's unanimous. Okay. So now we're on to public comment. Addressing the commission, the public is allowed to speak to any items or issues except those scheduled on the consent agenda or the regular agenda portion of the agenda. After being first recognized by the mayor, each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss, debate, these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments and questions to the commission. So do we have any general public comment? KT?
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Katie Welsh. I live at 732 Rhode Island. And I just wanted to let you and the public know that Tom Holland, who is the senator for part of Lawrence, is introducing a bill, SB 91, write that down. It's called the Homestead Property Tax Freeze Program. And Marcy Francisco is also on the committee this is going before, the State Taxation Committee. This is a freeze on property taxes for people 65 years or older who own their home. And this is something that we've talked about in affordable housing around Lawrence and around East Lawrence for years. We've talked to the county about it, and they said, oh, it could never happen in Douglas County. We brought it up to the city in the past, not to you guys, but it would be fabulous. In my eyes, it's a huge tool to help older people age in their homes and not be driven out by rising property taxes and gentrification. It's also for veterans who have a 50% disability or more. They can have the same freeze. I just think it's fabulous. I read through the whole thing. The hearing on it is Thursday morning. Some of us are going up to speak on it, and also for increased funding for the arts. But I just think if anybody feels moved to email or call someone on this taxation committee, it's SB 91, and ask them to vote it out of committee. Thank you.
Thank you, KT. Any other general public comments?
Hello, Michael Allman again. I wasn't able to be here, let's see, was it, I guess last week? Yeah, last week. But I wanted to comment on one of the items that was in the city manager's report, and thank city staff. It has to do with, apparently there was a proposal from some private developer to purchase a part of Brook Creek Park, 1 block from my house, which right now are a nature area preserve, it's a wooded area. And the developer, as I understand from looking at the maps, also included the city maintenance yard, which the city is going to be vacating, I think, next year and moving to North Iowa Street. We want to thank staff, I think particularly Parks and Recreation, I assume, who said that, no, that's not an appropriate location for that development. It's floodplain, it's sensitive lands and various things like that. Because I want to remind everybody here, the commissioners probably know, staff knows, that Brook Creek neighborhood has been working for actively now at least 4 years, but prior to that, some 10 years, to get a formal agreement between our neighborhood and Parks and Recreation Department to protect those woods as a natural wilderness nature area. So we still have that as one of our goals, and we look forward to working with Parks and Recreation. We're glad that they honored the spirit of that in turning down this proposal. We want to see it more formalized, though. We've proposed it twice now, and it hasn't met muster with city legal staff for some reasons that we're not quite clear on. But we're going to work with Parks and Recreation still to see if we can come up with that agreement. So I just wanted to thank staff and let you know where we are on that.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So any other general public comment? Anybody? All right. We're on to commission items. Any commission items?
I wanted to ask where we were, Tom, if you can give an update on where we are with the GARE initiative.
Is Danielle here this evening?
I can
give you an update. I think there isn't much of an update since the last time we spoke. Jasmine Moore and I have been working on this issue, and Jasmine spent some time visiting with some of the GARE staff. GARE is the, of course, I'm going to blank on the G and the A, but.
Governmental Alliance on Racial Equity.
There we go. Racial equity, and Jasmine spent some time talking with their staff about how to kind of bring that to our community. And they recommend the first step is filling out the application. The application does require you to kind of give a status update on where your community is regarding racial equity. So that's taking a little bit of time to put that together. And then the next step is there is a conference coming up in April that if you do apply to be a member, you can send us 2 folks, I think, to that conference to kind of learn about how it's being utilized in other cities throughout the country. And then we spent a little bit of time talking about kind of implementation strategies. In some communities, it's rolled out kind of as a community-wide enterprise. In others, it kind of starts in an organization, a particular department or an agency. And so we've kind of been exploring, is the city that department or agency that would kind of roll that out, or would we expand it to a bigger community kind of conversation? If we do kind of limit it to more of the city being the agency that would implement it, what would that look like? Would it be part of your strategic planning work? Would it be a separate plan? What would that look like? So we're kind of working through those issues, but that's sort of the update is, again, the first step is getting that application submitted, but we haven't accomplished that yet.
And so then the plan is to have that done so that folks could attend the April conference.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
think that's reasonable. I think it's, I don't know that there's a real serious review of the application, lengthy review process. I think it's just more lengthy on our end of documenting what we want to say when we submit that application.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to get an update on the downtown master planning process, problems that we were having, what's happened in the last week.
We had a great meeting and discussion with the consultant, and we ended up, Mother Nature intervened last week, and we had to cancel 3 of the meetings that were associated with that effort. So we are planning on having the consultant come back before this body to visit about an engagement plan and some recommendations of how to proceed. So we know we need to reschedule those meetings that were canceled, and also staff has talked with them about an expanded public engagement effort.
What about the notes that were taken from I think there were 2 of the focus groups that did actually take place. Did those get put online?
I don't know that they have completed those notes yet, but as soon as they do, we did make a promise that we would be posting those on the website with the project.
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
Any other commissioner items?
Yeah.
No.
It seems like we're kind of getting into serious pothole season. I'm just curious about how we're doing with that. I saw a crew, I believe it was today, on Kentucky Street. I was glad to see him working on some of the potholes. So can you just kind of give us a little idea of what's going on, and also how people can report potholes if they come across them?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There'll be Mike Lawless, Deputy Director for MSO. We are, now that we're in between storms, we're out in force trying to fill the potholes. We get requests from multiple sources, whether it be phone calls, emails, from the online forum that's out there, and we fill those just as fast as we can. I think we'll have a report on city manager's report next week detailing a little bit about the January potholes, but we filled about 3,740-some potholes last month, and we're working at the same this month.
Okay, I just want to say thank you very much for the work that you're doing, and we appreciate it. And to let people know that they can report the potholes, email, online, and by phone. Okay?
That's correct.
Thank you.
All right, any other commissioner items? Then we will move on to the meetings. Any meetings we need to add? Anybody doing that? I would like to point out that next Monday, City Hall is closed. Is that accurate? Yeah, it's closed.
Do we know any dates yet on when the downtown people, master planning people will come back?
No, I'm sorry, we don't, Commissioner. They were going to get back with us, and we'll be getting that on your schedule.
Okay. I plan on being out of town April 18th to the 30th. So I have this fear that the city manager stuff will be scheduled then, or any other big stuff might happen when I'm planning on being gone. So hopefully that won't happen for that either.
All right. Any other meetings we need to worry about, concerned about? Okay. Then we will move on to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
I have a motion from Commissioner Snowden, a second by Commissioner Herbert. All in favor?
Aye.
It's unanimous. So we'll move into our work session agenda. So I'll read. The work session provides an opportunity for the City Commission to discuss items in greater detail. As a general practice, the Commission will not make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Public comment related to the work session topics will be allowed at the end of the discussion on each item. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. So item number 1, we'll receive a draft ordinance amending the fines for the first-time marijuana possession.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Assistant City Attorney Maria Garcia. The ordinance before you today for consideration is a follow-up to a discussion that we had at an October work session meeting. Currently in municipal court, as we discussed in October, a person convicted of a first-time offense of marijuana possession generally receives a fine of $200 and a jail sentence, which is suspended. That means that they don't go to jail unless they violate the terms of their probation. The ordinance reflects, the current language reflects that the judge can assess up to a $1,000 fine, and that is consistent with state law that requires a Class B misdemeanor, which is what possession of marijuana is, to be up to $1,000, with possible jail time associated with that. It could be the fine and jail, or just the fine under state law. But the option for jail is still available under the state language. The third or subsequent offense for marijuana possession turns into a felony, and that would not be prosecuted in municipal court. It would go to district court. So at the conclusion of the meeting in October, the consensus among the commissioners was that there was an interest in option number 1 that staff provided, and option number 1 was to adopt Wichita's model. Wichita, of course, has an ordinance that has presumption language, that if somebody is convicted of marijuana first offense, they're over the age of 21 and they have a small quantity of marijuana, the presumption is that they will receive a $50 fine, and that's it, in addition to court costs, of course. This commission was also interested in removing the language concerning mandatory drug evaluations for convictions. And so based on that discussion with the commission, the ordinance before you makes some changes to our existing ordinance on the penalty for marijuana possession. So you'll see in the ordinance that now we have that presumptive language of $50. That, of course, can be changed by the commission. That was just a proposal by staff because that's what the Wichita ordinance states, but that's up to your discretion on what the fine should be, with the caveat that it can't be more than $1,000, of course, and I know that's not really the interest of the commission, but there is no minimum under state law, so there's no minimum $50, no minimum $100, so it really would range from $1 to $1,000. The language about mandatory drug evaluations was removed from the conviction portion of the ordinance, but I do want to note for you that there is a section at the very end of the ordinance that has to do with diversion. And that was not something that we discussed at length, that particular language at the last meeting, and so I'd welcome your feedback on that, whether the commission wanted the eval language to apply just to convictions or whether you would want it to be removed from the diversion language as well. There will be some fiscal impact to the city, as I noted in my staff memo. Right now, the fines that are $200 stay with the city. If the fine is lowered to $50, then that's $150 less per case that would stay with the city.
What about court costs?
Court costs are not affected by this ordinance. They're currently $63. A portion of that does stay with the city, but a portion gets sent to the state.
So it would actually be 50 plus 63.
Right. With that, I'll be happy to stand for questions, and I'm eager to hear your feedback on this new language.
I'm concerned about the change, or I should say, I do want to look at changing the age to 18 instead of 21. Since we are such a college town, I think that might be a good one. And because there are court costs, as we discussed, tacked onto it, I would be interested in lowering the actual fine itself, because they will be paying more on top of that.
Okay.
And then also, I was really concerned about potential bias related to kind of systemic racism and enforcement of laws when it has to do with repeat offenders. So I was a little concerned about that as well. I don't know if that made sense. Did that make sense?
I'm not sure, you might be referring to the progressive penalty. So the penalty for a second conviction is higher than a first. Is that what you mean?
Well, I was talking to Jennifer a little bit before the meeting, and obviously she's the lawyer in the room too, and you are too. But I wanted to make sure that when I bring that up, that she would help me to perhaps explain what I was
Okay,
trying
great.
to say.
Sure.
I can reflect our conversation, which was in regard to, whether or not certain individuals would be targeted if they've had a first offense and are known to law enforcement. And so the piece of that conversation that I brought in is the police study, the police contact study that's getting ready to occur, that I don't have, statistics in front of me to identify whether or not there is targeting, particularly in regard to marijuana ordinance violations. But that's certainly something that may come to light. With that contact study, I think that, anecdotally, we know that there is disproportionate arrests, not anecdotally, with data, for minorities, but in Lawrence. And so I don't know necessarily that we can extrapolate from that it applies specifically to this ordinance, but there may be a tendency for disproportionate targeting based on that, particularly since the second offense is treated differently from the first offense.
Right.
And I think that for me, I don't, is there a reason why the second offense would necessarily need to be different as far as the fines and requirements?
Well, so the state statute prescribes a higher penalty for a second offense. Instead of $1,000, it's now $2,500 for a second offense, but there is no minimum either on a second offense, so.
Thank you, Commissioner, by the way.
So you wouldn't have to raise it for the second offense? We wouldn't have to follow that?
There's no state language that says we have to have a minimum for it.
Okay.
That's correct. The Wichita model, which I know there was a lot of interest in, applies only to the first conviction, and it may be related to some comments from Vice Mayor Ananda. The Wichita ordinance applies to anyone over the age of 21 who has a small quantity, but it excludes anyone who has a previous conviction of marijuana, but then also anyone who has been convicted of a felony, I believe, and who has had a Class A misdemeanor within the preceding 3 years. So that could be, if they have a criminal history, this doesn't apply to them. We didn't add that restrictive language to our ordinance, even though it is part of the Wichita ordinance. So
Okay.
might shed some light on it.
Research of the Wichita ordinance and the way it's been enacted, are you finding that judges in that area are adhering to the presumptive penalty?
So I did reach out to the city attorney's office and learned that it has been going pretty well. They haven't had many issues or challenges with the ordinance, that there is the presumption of $50. I did hear from the city attorney's office that since the ordinance was enacted in summer of 2017, there hasn't been any case where the marijuana weight was over 32 grams, and so the great majority of those cases are going to be less and reflect the intent of the ordinance. There are some people who would be excluded because of their qualification list. A lot of them are under the age of 21. A lot of them have criminal history. So I can't say that the overwhelming majority of people in Wichita will have only the $50 fine, but for people who meet the qualifications, the judge generally assesses the $50 fine.
What would be the potential ramifications if we lowered the fine to even more?
So one potential ramification really is that that's less money that goes into the general fund. Right now, if we had it at a $50 fine, that's reducing it by $150 per case. That stays with the city, but that's really the main and only thing I could think of.
And so I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It is possible to remove the heightened requirements to the diversion piece, just because of the inequitable nature of that. In order to not have a misdemeanor on your record, you have to have more money. I think I understand the intent of that, but I think it precludes folks who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it to maintain a clean record.
And I'll just look over at municipal court manager and the city prosecutor and just ask whether that's something that would work to remove the mandatory eval for diversions. Yeah. Do you want to come up here?
You come to the microphone so people at
Yeah,
home can hear.
Sorry.
Yeah, if that's listed in the ordinance, then we wouldn't have to require that. If you put it as a may, then we might have a case where we would think that it's appropriate.
Thanks.
I like the idea of making that discretionary rather than required.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Any other?
I'm just trying to understand how people between 18 and 21 would be considered if we kept this at 21.
How they would be considered?
Yeah, I mean, how, this wouldn't apply to them, what would apply?
Right, so then the maximum under the current proposed language would be $1,000, which I don't think that gets assessed ever, really. So the judge would have discretion to fine between $1 and $1,000. There could still be a $50 fine even if they're 19 years old. It just,
Okay.
it's up to the judge's discretion in
So
that case.
if we don't change it here, they still have more discretion
Right.
than this?
Right.
Okay.
This still does, just to clarify, this still does give the judge discretion because state law requires the discretion, so it's up to 1,000, but the language is structured so that there's a strong presumption
Okay, right.
that it's
Yeah.
50.
$50.
Right,
And
Okay.
so there would be no presumption in the
exactly,
18 to 20, so there's no
Yeah.
presumption there.
right.
Yeah. So you would have to lower that age.
I would have interest in lowering that age. I think the
Yeah.
court
Yeah.
system ought to
Yeah.
treat a legal adult as a legal adult.
Yeah. I would agree, yeah, definitely. And I would also be interested in lowering the fine more. I just looking at the math, if we did lower to the 25 that Leslie was talking about, that's only $6,000 for the 244 charges in 2017.
Someone had mentioned something in regard to, in one of the pieces of information that we received from the community, the co-occurring charge of paraphernalia. And I just wondered, what percentage of cases have paraphernalia? I'm making an assumption that they're probably most of them, maybe not, but what kind of impact the interrelation between those two things are? Are we getting rid of one to swoop it into another kind of?
Right. I'll let the city prosecutor talk about how often the paraphernalia pieces come up, but this ordinance does not touch or do anything
Right.
with the paraphernalia language currently. The drug paraphernalia under our code encompasses all kinds of drugs. In addition to marijuana, it could include meth or heroin or cocaine. So we haven't touched that language since the conversation has focused primarily on marijuana. But as to your question about whether paraphernalia usually comes with a possession of marijuana, I'll let Elizabeth Hofoka come back up.
Can you restate your question?
Yes. So specifically, I think the question that we were bringing to you is, how often is there a co-occurrence of possession and paraphernalia charged together?
So I don't know specifically the answer to that. I was discussing with Vicki Stanwicks that we have roughly the same amount of marijuana charges as paraphernalia charges each month. But because our recording system is charge-based, those could be cases that are charged possession of marijuana and possession of drug paraphernalia. They could be cases that are just charged possession of drug paraphernalia, and they could be cases that are just charged possession of marijuana. So it does happen, but as far as is it happening in every case, no, but I couldn't tell you the specific numbers.
Okay. Do you, is there a requirement for a drug or alcohol assessment with the paraphernalia charge?
No.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
I got one. Maria, what's the impact to our law enforcement? Do they have any concerns for?
I might prefer to hear it from an actual
Casey,
law enforcement
yeah.
officer.
Casey Cooper, I'm a captain of the Florence Police Department on the patrol division. So you're wanting to know if this is going to change our enforcement action?
Yeah, or just how it will impact you or the force?
None.
No.
And this is after we do our job. So this is based on penalties, and we're going to enforce whatever laws that are out there equally, regardless of what they are, and then the rest is up to the prosecutors and the courts to decide.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Did you have a question for Casey?
I just wanted to, not for Casey, thank you, Casey. We had significant correspondence with regard to the fact that the jail sanction is still included in this ordinance. The possibility exists, and I just wanted to be real clear about why that's still in there. It's my understanding under home rule, we can't put it out.
Right. Thanks for that question. So the language in the proposed ordinance did not remove or amend the existing language, which gives the judge discretion to assess a jail penalty. So the language says, in addition to such fine, the convicted person may be sentenced to serve jail time. And that's consistent with state law because this is a Class B misdemeanor. The fine is up to $1,000 and or up to 6 months in jail. And so the option or the discretion for the judge should still be reflected in our ordinance. But again, because we're adding that presumption language that the penalty is going to be $50, that really could be the end of it. The judge could just assess a $50 fine and nothing else,
Right.
in addition to court costs.
Yeah. And I also appreciate the information that was provided by the court manager about how much the city spent on people who had been incarcerated because of probation violations that arose out of this this ordinance. So the numbers I've got is city was billed for 21 days, and the amount billed would be, depending on whether it was actually paid in 2018 or 2017, would be between $1,696 and $1,814. So that's a very small portion of the amount that we were billed in 2017, which was $668,133. So I appreciate getting that information. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Good. All right, we'll open it up to public comment at this time. Any public comment?
Hi, I'm Chris Flowers. I have a few notes. Why is it just for 21 and over? This ordinance isn't about making pot legal, it's about reducing the punishment for getting caught with it. Why do those between 18 to 21 deserve to be punished punished harder for a crime that is just as illegal for someone over 21? Marijuana possession is a crime. Would you give 18 to 20-year-olds stiffer punishments for speeding, shoplifting, or embezzlement? Also, $50 is too much. How about $4.20 to send a message to the state of Kansas? That message being that marijuana laws are ridiculous, and we support the potheads in their struggles against the brown-backed blowhards that run our state. Thank you.
Hello, Kirsten Kuhn, Broken Arrow neighborhood. I had originally been going to read that whole statement I sent you guys, but you were asking a lot of great questions, so I'm just going to come up here and wing it. I love the enthusiasm. I love the way you guys are moving. I love the questions about the paraphernalia. Thumbs up all around. But I am really concerned, like we discussed, the first and second offenses, disproportionate arrest rates. It's really concerning that just because maybe you got away with it once or you didn't, now suddenly you're going to get strapped with all these other things. I also had concerns about the drug eval language because the new DSM lists alcohol use and cannabis use different, and the criterion are different. Alcohol use, legal trouble isn't counted as a potential criterion for alcohol abuse disorder, but it is for cannabis. So if we're having people that come across and have even one conviction, that's going to give them a check mark right there to have a potential mental health disorder applied to them. So the more that we can do to reduce these penalties or anything for people getting a conviction or anything we can do here, I think is really going to be really important, because you don't want to be sending someone who have, two people that one uses alcohol exactly the same as cannabis, but the cannabis guy is getting the books thrown at him simply because his substance of choice is different. And it seems to me pretty risky, especially given the cost of all these evals and the cost of then being referred to treatment for any number of hours, any number of weeks, and even months. So I hope you guys go the right way. We're rooting for you. I'm loving what I'm hearing. And then I'll stop wasting your time.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you. So any other public comment on this item?
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. Hayden Maples, I live in the Deerfield area, and just want to echo the appreciation for listening to feedback, taking it, asking great questions. I think it's heading the right direction. On the evaluation, it sounds like that's not required, so potentially changing the language to a presumption of not doing it, like some of the other language, or removing it entirely, and then same thing for paraphernalia, to either lower that charge or remove it entirely. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Hayden.
Hi, Commissioners. Laura Green. I just wanted to remind the Commissioners why this ordinance was enacted to begin with, why I came here in 2006, and it was enacted in 2007. The Higher Education Drug Provision, which is part of the Comprehensive Higher Education Act, denies or delays student financial aid for students who are convicted in state or federal court of a marijuana charge. It's on what's colloquially known as the FAFSA, which is the student financial aid application. So if they are convicted in a municipal court, they will not lose that financial aid. So I do think it's important to remember that we need to leave that at 18 for our college students. Because really, what is the point of having a local ordinance? We could just get rid of the ordinance and send everybody to district court. So that's, I think, an important thing to remember. I'm not going to read my statement. You have my statement, but I just wanted to just kind of summarize what's happened since we last met, just nationwide. I think, there's this big rock that is rolling downhill, and it's gathering a lot of steam. And in our last big nationwide election, Michigan voted to legalize marijuana across the board. Utah and Missouri legalized it for medical use. Legalization bills are working their way through state legislatures in New Mexico, New Jersey, and Illinois right now. Vermont was the first state to legalize marijuana through the legislature. So, Kansas even has 2 medical marijuana bills that are working their way to committee. So, there's a lot of momentum out there right now. I just looked up the polling numbers today. 88% across America support medical marijuana, and 84% of Americans support no jail time for marijuana. And these are nationwide polls. So if you think, they're polling across the country, what is the polling going to be like in Kansas? Well, it's probably going to be pretty high. It probably won't be 84%, but it's most likely, over 60. 60% of Americans support legalizing marijuana. I don't really want to come back every couple years and say, hey, let's lower the fine a little bit more. Let's lower it a little bit more. Let's be thoughtful about it now. Let's put it in context of what's happening. So this morning, there was a hearing in the Senate, in our nation's Senate, and they were talking about opioid use, and they kept bringing up medical marijuana. And it's just kind of everywhere I look now. I know that I'm kind of focused on marijuana to talk to you today, but I have no doubt that marijuana is going to be legalized nationally, and Canada and Mexico have both legalized. So anyway, that's just the summation of what's going on.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate it. Any other public comment?
Brian Thomas, 19th and Edgeley. Today, in preparation for this, I was reviewing the last working session on October 9th, and it appears from what I was watching at home and then what I was told right before I got here, that the commission has, for the most part, asked high-quality, good questions on the current topic. So, but one thing that really stood out to me when I was reviewing the previous session was there was a lot of talk about kind of springboarding from this into an overall review of municipal court practices, in particular with regards to a more equitable justice system. At least 4 of the 5 commissioners directly spoke to, for instance, the that diversion fees were classist in the sense that basically you're buying a clean record for $100. That not everybody can pay that, and at least 2 people spoke about 2 of the commissioners spoke directly about taking this on, having an overall review. And I'd just like to remind the commissioners that that topic came up, and that hopefully it will be something that the commission continues to work to address in the coming year, in their coming terms. And that's really it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Any other public comments?
Good evening, Madam Mayor, Vice Mayor. My name's Ted Boyle, and I'm up here representing myself. And I believe that the commission is headed down the right road. Some of you might be old enough to remember the Vern Miller days.
Oh, yeah.
When
Yes.
he used to jump out of the
Those were
trunk.
scary.
And make a spectacular bust or something like that. But, this is a victimless crime, and I think wasting a lot of the taxpayers' money prosecuting these cases. And I believe that this is what you're going to enact here is going to be a short term. Every state around us is changing the marijuana laws, and I think with our new Democratic governor and the way the legislature is, I think we're headed that direction. I mean, it's economically, look at Colorado. I mean, economically, that's where it is, the money. And, you're prosecuting people that are just not doing anything against society, and at least ought to be treated like alcohol, same regulations, that type of deal, but not anymore. And I think $50 is too much money, and I think it shouldn't be prosecuted at all. But then I think we'll see that happen in another couple of years when medical marijuana comes into the state, and probably shortly after that, you're going to see total legalization. So you can't think of just today you better think of down the road and spend that money on real crimes, you know, so thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you. Any other public comments on this item? All right. Bring it back up here.
We're done.
I'll start off. First of
Okay.
all, shout out to Ted for that Vern Miller reference. You don't,
Yeah.
you don't get one of those every meeting. That was the blank space on my bingo board there. So, but
It makes me shudder.
as it relates to this ordinance, one of the things I believe I talked about last time we engaged this conversation was every year we're asked as a commission to draft a legislative statement, things that we prioritize and that we hope our state legislature looks at. And you know, maybe it's the pessimist in me, but sometimes I worry that, you know, it's just a piece of paper and that if we don't have the support at the state level, and I know we have the support from our delegation, but overall as a majority, a lot of times that stuff just falls on deaf ears. So when I look at what we do as a local governing body, I see issues like this as our real legislative statement. This is our way of enacting policy that we can send to the state level and say, this is what we're doing because this is what we believe, not just with words, but with action. And so, you know, when I look at this, I think somebody had sent me an email, or a couple somebodies, I guess, and had kind of joked that you know, it's the least we could do to be as progressive as Wichita, which, you know, is probably a fair statement. I don't mean this to be hyperbole at all, but I would advocate that the way we draw up the language of this ordinance in order to send a legislative statement, so to speak, is I would advocate that we make our presumptive penalty $1. This is our way. We have no ability to legalize marijuana at the city level. This is a state policy. But I would advocate that by making the penalty $1, we're sending a message that we are pushing for the state to look at what is happening everywhere else in the United States. I anticipate in a very short period of time, like we were on a lot of issues where we were a little bit behind, we will very likely be one of the last states to act, and that's unfortunate. And, you know, I've been a Kansan my whole life. That's something I've dealt with my whole life, is we're always sometimes last on the cart. But on this issue as a city, I think we can make a statement. And so I would advocate in all seriousness that we look at a presumptive penalty of $1.
Well, I'm interested in that as well. I kind of have a different perspective with it as an Uber driver, actually. I drive a lot of people from Daisy Hill to the Hawk, but in between there's a gaggle of girls in there talking, and some of them are from Colorado or wherever, and I always overhear them saying, you know, marijuana is actually illegal here. And I mean, people have no idea that it is here in Kansas. So I kind of think there is a little bit of a mixed message that we have for these out-of-state students, that it's like you have to come to Kansas and learn all of our particular rules. So in that case, I could see how I could support a $1 fine for it.
I don't disagree.
This is a work session, right?
Right, so we can't make a decision. Yeah.
I think that in addition to your suggestion, Matthew, a couple of things that I've heard pretty consistently that I would support in this ordinance is making the first and second offense equitable,
Yes.
as well as reducing the age to 18.
And making the drug eval discretionary and diversion.
Correct, yeah, thank you for reminding me.
Because that's in there now. That's what they were proposing, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, it's required in a diversion.
Oh,
On
yeah.
D.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think we need to make that
Yeah.
discretionary on the
definitely.
part of the judge.
I agree.
Yeah, the DSM classification is
That's
worrisome.
Yeah, I'm in favor of anything we can do just to decriminalize this. And I know we can't do it because of the state law, but however close we can get to that line, I'm in favor of getting to that line. So. Anything else?
I think that's about it.
Okay. I think we're done. We're done. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I do want to look at future diversions, as Mr. Thomas mentioned.
Yeah.
The springboard effect, I'm happy to take that on.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
We should give people a moment to leave.
No, we're not.
Don't
Affordable
jinx it.
housing.
Huh?
Affordable housing.
Holy shit. Well, I think I made a mistake, and I apologize for that.
Bleeping the mayor.
There's another bingo card. Oh, Lordy.
We need that door shut. Thanks, Laura.
Oh, Lordy, Lordy, Lordy.
Welcome to the mayor's chair.
I'm sorry. I really apologize.
Well, there's the headline right there.
Yeah.
It wasn't me this time.
Yeah. Yeah, for once, yeah.
Every Tuesday is an exercise in humility.
That's the one advice Leslie gave me, and it is true. So item number 2, discussion with Affordable Housing Advisory Board. So we have a staff.
You want me to do it? You want me to introduce it? Sure. Good evening, Commissioners. Diane Stoddard, Assistant City Manager. So you all had requested a meeting with the Affordable Housing Advisory Board. And so Shannon is here this evening, Shannon Oury, who's the Vice Chair of the Advisory Board. And there's a number of Advisory Board members that are also in the audience this evening. And they would like to have a dialogue with you this evening. And I think Shannon is going to kind of go over some of the recent discussions that the board has had with their retreat that they had last month and engage in any other dialogue that you all might like to have. So with that, I might turn it over to Shannon.
So I'm the vice chair. Ron Gacious is the chair, and he was unable to be here today. We've had a meeting, and as you all know, because you formed us, that we have been working on this issue since end of 15, beginning of 16. Last year, we added a whole slew of new members. And so part of our process for last year was getting some of the new members up to speed. And so then, gosh, was it just yesterday we had a meeting, and then last month we had a retreat. And some of the things that we've learned through the housing study and just our efforts is that this problem is wide and deep. And so you'll see in the details of the retreat summary and what our ongoing goals are, is we're really trying to hit at all of the spectrum, from people coming out of homelessness, very or extremely low-income renters, to the other extreme of low to moderate income individuals who want to become homeowners. And as we try to cover that very broad spectrum, we've set some goals based on the housing study and also the retreat and the information that we got. And so what I can say is the board is working very hard to try to figure out how to work all along that spectrum, and am grateful for this opportunity to meet with you and get your feedback on where we've come so far and where you'd like to see us go.
I had a couple kind of, I don't know if you call them issues or concerns or how you would label them, but the first one that popped out at me is you know, we're trying to address low-income and middle-income people. And I guess I'd always had some kind of optimistic hope that if we really work hard on the low-income side, that that would actually have a domino effect for the middle-income side. So perhaps if we're creating units for low-income people, that actually frees up units that middle-income people might be able to get into. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
I understand what you're saying. I'm not
Yeah.
positive. I mean, I think I think one of the things that the consultants identified for us is that sometimes what we're seeing is the robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? So that some first-time home buyer or a lower-priced home is being purchased for rental purposes. And so there's a give and take with a lot of demand for those price points. And so I'm really not positive that if we deal with the very low income, that we really, sort of get much movement in the middle or moderate income.
Yeah, that makes sense, thank you. And also the other thing I was kind of thinking about was, we've been talking about, and I think we actually did on our second reading, the homeless task force. We disbanded that because there really hadn't been much action on that. And then there's talk, of course, of merging Social Service Advisory Board or perhaps CDBG under your board. Is that, you start out by saying our problem is wide and deep. Does that actually make your problem wider and deeper?
I don't necessarily think it does, in the sense that some of the same things, and if I understand correctly, and Diane, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what we were presented on Monday was that the Community Development Advisory Board really allocates both the home funds and the CDBG funds. And I think the proposal is to move the allocation of the home funds to this board. Basically, we are going to be trying to solve some of those same problems that the home funds have always been working to solve. Unfortunately, what we've seen is a very serious, does this thing work? What we've seen is a very serious decrease in those funds, and so.
In federal monies, yeah.
And so a lot of things that the city used to be able to do, and this I got from the city, so this is the city's, I got this from Danny. And basically, you can see where all these fundings used to be, and then what has been happening to them. And so a lot of our demand, right, is being driven by the fact that things we used to be able to do with these funds, we can no longer do all that we have done before. And so the Affordable Housing Trust, we will, at this point, it's very broad. So if you look at the goals where we talk about the things that weatherization and some of those things, that's what these funds have traditionally done. It's just that they've been reduced to a level that we're certainly not gaining ground, we're losing ground, and so it will do a lot of the very same things.
I like the sound of that, definitely. I still have that kind of remaining fear having to do with merging groups a little too much. I don't want to overpower one group perhaps and make it a real majority rule kind of situation. I still kind of even though you have a very large board with a very large budget, I don't want you all to completely overshadow, other boards that may or may not get merged in you. So I guess if you ever hear me speaking against merging those, that's really where that's coming from, and not because I have any kind of distrust or no faith with AHAB, of course. It's just I kind of worry about the outcome in general. So is there going to be perhaps a new task force under AHAB that will deal directly, or specifically, I should say, with homeless issues?
I'm not aware of any discussion of that
Okay.
topic.
questions? Shannon?
Yeah, I'd like to cover a few topics. Shannon, my understanding of the goals is that we are looking for permanent dispersed affordable housing. Is that still kind of where we're headed with this?
Yes, I mean, I think everybody, and I want this is a big chunk of the committee here, and a couple people over on this side. I mean, we are really looking for the permanently affordable.
Right.
We definitely have identified that we want to serve extremely low, which is the 30% of AMI, and that target. I do think there are some pieces that will, like the weatherization. I mean, we're still having conversations, and, you know, this was an idea that Marty had, but that I think is something we should pursue, which is, you know, if we put money into your home for weatherization or those type of things, that either the city, through one of their other agencies, has an option or a first right of refusal to purchase that property should it ever be sold. Because weatherization, you wouldn't put so much in that the owners would want you to put a deed restriction on their property, but we certainly, in exchange, could, if we're willing to pay, you know, a market rate, should be able to.
And one exception to that dispersal is in senior housing, because it's sometimes a good idea to put seniors into places like Vermont Towers or Babcock Place, where otherwise you might not want to have concentrations of affordable housing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
With regard to the last grant process, kind of the thumbnail sketch is, you guys went through the process of the RFP, looking at the grants, you scored them, you had discussion, and there were two grants that kind of stood out in the scoring. I think they scored identically. One was $200,000, one was $90,000. And you know, the recommendation that came from AHAB was that we do $90,000 for one and $110,000 for the other. Now, I realize that you weren't in these discussions, so.
Correct.
One of the things that I wanted to just mention is that when we sent this back to AHAB to consider a recommendation to fund the additional $90,000, kind of the genesis of that suggestion was that one of these grants was funded at 100% level, the other was funded at 55%. And we didn't understand what the difference was and what that process that brought us from, you know, an identical scoring but then funding one at 100%, one at 55%. So I just wanted to clear up any concern that we were offering that since they were scored identically.
Right, and as I say, I can't speak to that because I was in none of those discussions.
Yes.
But I will say that in our discussion Monday, we talked a lot about refining our matrix and developing something that gives us a little bit better vehicle to communicate why we made our decisions. You know, one of the comments that was made is that there was a lot of questions and those type of things that happened during the presentations that weren't in the original matrix that we didn't have a mechanism or we didn't capture. And so we are, as a board, very aware of that, of this issue, and we are working to resolve it.
And I would request that in the future, when you have identically scored grant proposals, that you go into some detail as to why you're funding them at the level. So if there's a significant difference like that, where one was 100 and the other one was 55%. With regard to your matrix, I'm trying to understand how something like the Universe City program would be considered in that grant process, because that's something that the city would be perhaps doing as a city project. And I see a kind of a tie-in, actually, with my concerns about that 23rd Street corridor, because I believe there's a lot of workforce housing in those neighborhoods that is suffering some degradation, you know, due to, frankly, student rentals. So I'm wondering if, if the city was going to undertake a program like that, how that would be considered by AHAB.
Yeah, and, well, the first thing I would say is I don't think it'd be that much different than like CDBG funds or home funds, in that a lot of times the city is an applicant for those funds, and those boards basically do a very similar evaluation. So I would imagine they'd be evaluated similarly as luckily I've been to a lot of those meetings because we receive home funds, and the city is in those requests. And so I don't foresee the city being foreclosed from being an applicant.
Okay. Turning to the actual trust fund, I think it'd be important to talk about what actually this trust fund is. My understanding is that it is actually a city fund. It is subject to the decisions that are made by the city commission as to what gets funded. So it's not like there's a corpus in the trust and we spend the income or something like that. This is a city fund that gets budgeted and is subject to these decisions. Now, with regard to the sales tax, there's ballot language that will guide the expenditure of those funds. But have you seen trust funds that operate differently in other communities when you've done your research?
I don't really think that I have. I think we're very clear that we're an advisory board and all the final decisions reside with your body.
Well, it seems to me that there are other places that have funds that are actually trust funds that do some of this work. There's an example called a community development financial institution, which is a mix of government, philanthropic, and sometimes some investor money. And I would encourage you to consider that option as another way to attract philanthropic donations. Frankly, donors have not been knocking themselves out to donate money to the fund that we have because it's simply a city fund. But there's the possibility that there could be a different way to leverage the money, okay, by putting in some money to a CDFI. I'm not sure I would suggest that we do that with sales tax money, but with other appropriations, we might do that. So I'd encourage the board to really look into CDFIs.
Commissioner, I want to jump in.
Sure.
That is something that staff is looking into, is CDFI, to see if it might be a vehicle that would be something that would be useful in this case. So we're doing some of that research, and we'll be making that report back to you.
Thank you, Don.
Good.
So one comment / question. What caught my attention was under short-term goals. I don't know if it's possible for us to put that on the screen for folks to see at home or in the audience, but, oh, there it is, right there. Short-term goals, subpoint A there says, consider passing a city ordinance that makes source of income, including Section 8, a protected class, i.e. prevents landlords from refusing to accept housing voucher tenants. During your retreat and conversation about this as a short-term goal, I'm curious as to was there any look at case law regarding this? The part of the language that caught my attention was the including Section 8. I know that the state of California had a source of income discrimination law that it enacted in the early 2010s, or early 2000s. And in 2010, it actually went to appellate court, Sabby versus Sterling. And in that court, California noted that Section 8 could not be counted as a source of income because the relationship of a Section 8 payment is that the money is transferred from the government to the housing authority, from the housing authority to the landlord, and at no point is that money actually income for the tenant. And so the California courts looked at it and said things like SSI certainly qualify as a source of income, any sort of alimony payment, things like that were legally sources of income. But in that particular case, the court ruled that Section 8 vouchers are not actually sources of income for the tenant, and therefore did not apply to the sources of income discrimination law. So I'd be curious as if we look at crafting language like that, whether we are actually have the legal bounds to include Section 8 within that sources of income. So that would be my concern to pass on to the board.
So that's something that staff can review and research and get back.
Any of those kind of things would be things that I think would be discussed with legal if we get to the point of bringing up an ordinance, yes.
Thanks.
Like a year or two ago, we had an apartment complex that had a serious cockroach problem. That I will never forget that article, I think, because there were kids living in there. Of course, the newspaper talked about how it impacted the kids physically. And I get a little concerned when I say we're going to use money to bring units up to code, because I don't want to inadvertently reward people for having such deplorable conditions. So how do we, or I guess how will the board, kind of figure out how to manage that so it's not something that we reward to landowners?
Well, I think one of the things that, is our focus is that whatever, we recommend the money to be spent, it will be both to be an affordable unit, but also a habitable unit.
Mm-hmm.
And, the worst case scenario would be to put money in through like a TBRA, rent assistance, in a unit that isn't acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that is probably a detail that, if the housing authority, we inspect every unit that we put a voucher in. If there are other similar programs, we probably, that is something that, we haven't faced yet, but certainly you want to identify either through the city's inspection team or some other way, to make sure that we're not subsidizing units that are substandard.
Mm-hmm.
So on the rent assistance, that's sort of one piece. On the capital improvements type of thing, that's, I think the thing as I got in this business in the housing authority, we have maps of Douglas County on several of our walls, and one of the things that first struck me is that we're a city between two rivers, and we have big swaths of floodplain, and we are not getting any more land. And so, any unit that we can take and make habitable through and maintain that its affordable status, I think most of the board is really in favor of figuring out how to do that rather than to lose a unit that could be affordable.
I'm in favor of taking over apartment complexes that have those issues, and rehabbing them where the city or the trust or whoever owns it. I think that's a really good idea, or even hotels, older hotels. So I just don't want to give people funds for rehabbing where they maintain ownership of it, I suppose, as well. So I'm glad that that's something that you all are talking about and thinking about, bigger picture kind of ideas. So I'm glad to hear that.
I would add, as somebody who operates a property management business, that the Section 8 inspections are, this is not meant as an insult to the city, but they are a more thorough inspection than I've received from the city, in terms of the depth of what is inspected and the expectations. So for what it's worth,
Yeah.
it's a detailed inspection.
there's this balance between code enforcement and, you know, low income housing, that getting it up to, you know, just basic quality is kind of different but then when, of course, you guys are dealing with it, Scott, in your department, where you go out and inspect places and the amount of money that they have to put into it to make it. But then again, that someone lives there, you know, someone that's very low income. So there are options to live somewhere else, perhaps while an in-depth redevelopment might be going of their unit or the building, you know, they might be displaced by that. So that's a very difficult balance beam to figure out, so.
Well, I have just a couple of things. I want to echo Commissioner Boley in the discussion of the matrix and when the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, when they make a decision on the funding aspect of it, that they provide as much discussion as possible, just so we can get a better understanding of why you made a decision, because that was one thing that I just never really got out of that last discussion. So, and I know you guys are aware of that, and I appreciate it. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the leveraging. I know that your goal is for a 6-to-1 leverage. Is that going to be part of your matrix?
It has been, yeah.
It has been. So it's going to be your preferences to go to 6-to-1?
Yeah,
Or just to leverage as a whole?
And I don't know that we've ever achieved 6-to-1
Yeah,
yet.
I don't.
And the first couple of years has been the needing to get applications, and I think as the sales tax comes on, the amount of money that is at issue increases the likelihood of more applications. And so, but we have generally taken the highest leverage of the projects that we received applications for.
All right. So this idea that the fund itself, I would just like to emphasize that I believe it's important for us to look outside of our box of money and to make sure we're going outside to find all those grants, all those funds that are out there, because I know there's more out there that I've heard about, and I know staff has probably been looking into it, that we shouldn't just limit ourselves to the fund that we have, that we've got an opportunity to use that money and to leverage it out with outside sources, such as what Commissioner Boley said about the CDFI, which looked like a really good program. So I would really encourage that. I think that was it that I had.
Rebecca Buford is with the Housing Trust, and she's the best leverager that we've had. She's done it.
Well, I will say, a few of the projects that have been funded and some that weren't funded, that Habitat presented, have had close to 6-to-1
Yeah, I've
leverages.
seen some of them
So,
close.
not everyone by any means, but that's always the goal in an application, and I think we need to force that as much as we can when we make decisions. But yeah, there certainly is a lot of ability to demand that as long as we get enough applications, and I think we can continue, because housing is expensive, and I think most projects leverage and have to have several types of funds coming in to really make them possible. So I guess my point being, that's not outside of our realm of experience, anybody who's developing affordable housing.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca, appreciate it. Yeah, there was one other thing I had regarding how many times a year are we going to have the process? Is it going to be like an ongoing, or just an RFP that's put out a couple times a year, or do you know yet?
I think what we know so far is that this year we're gonna have one within the first 6 months to a limited of 250,000, and then another process in that November timeframe, because we're trying to schedule that RFP process to coincide with the tax credit, with the people who are gonna try to leverage funds to do tax credit projects. And then I believe we're focused on sort of that time period to do in the cycle that the Kansas Housing Resource Corporation uses, so that our funds can match up with other funds and hopefully get more of those type of projects in our community. And then I think at that point we will kind of evaluate, okay, how did that work? if there's money we haven't used, kind of what do we do now? I think we'll evaluate that once we kind of see how that process works.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Did I get that right?
I did have another thought. I always have lots of thoughts when it comes to affordable housing. One thing that I feel like I've really pushed for over the past few years, especially Matthew knows this, is that, of course, public transit, has a fund that they've been collecting over time. That drives me to no end. But we won't go into that. But one thing I think that housing and developments can take advantage of is that I really feel like sidewalks and bus stops is something that's a source of funding that might be controversial this year or in the future when I'm not sitting here. But I do feel like that's a source of funding we can use to help low-income developments and that we should look at doing more of. And I would really love it, of course, if we had more bus stop amenities, such as even just a sidewalk there at the side of the road, or getting you the 10 feet from the sidewalk to the curb. But also shelters as well, because I think that's really important for dignity of low-income people, is not having to stand out in the rain, and wait for their bus. And also I think that might hopefully help to drive ridership of our bus system as well, and even just making sure that we have good bus stops. As KT reminded us the other day, we still don't have an actual bus stop out at the shelter in the jail. So I really want that to be something that we collaborate better on for the Affordable Housing Board with our other advisory boards. Of course, collaboration has been a big issue for us. It's in our strategic plan to better collaborate. So I hope that's something that you'll look at.
Sure.
And not that I want to add to your wide and deep river already, but it's just, that's a piece of it. It's a big piece, transportation.
Okay, anything else? So public comment now? Public comment, anybody?
Dan Dannenberg, 2702 University Drive. I knew it was just a matter of time before the Lawrence City Commission went to pot. Affordable housing is like military intelligence. It's an oxymoron. And particularly in a place like Lawrence where, according to the housing market analysis of August 2018, there are 20,000 KU students living off campus. And I can tell you, as one who lives in a neighborhood where this infestation has taken root, it does nothing for the livability of the neighborhood, let alone the economics. There are two places, two units right next to me, one this way, one that way, that have been empty for years. One of them is for sale for $200,000, which is way above the market, as I understand it. But that's the way it goes. And we have no means in Lawrence of coping with rental properties. I believe I saw one statistic in the housing market analysis that 54% of the housing units in Lawrence are renter occupied. Well, that means we have a whole business that is essentially unregulated. We need a separate entity that is divorced from the smarmy politics and bureaucracy of planning and development services. We need a housing authority that is run independently, and that would take a lot of And it would mean that a lot of these other things would have to go away. But this authority would be governed by 3 people and overseen by a special master appointed by a federal district judge. Because the history of the Lawrence City Commission looking after this is not a pleasant one. And we're going to get a new city manager in, I don't know when, but one day. And we have a university that contributes nothing to community impact. Oh yes, we have the concerts and we have the, but we had 2 punch-ups on Ohio Street recently. It's just a matter of time before one of those punch-ups ends up in a homicide. So we need the university to contribute funds, I say $5 million, to fund code enforcement.
Dan.
And do like that. And oh, by the way, you don't want to hear from the public. You just don't. You want omerta.
Thank you, Dan.
I want to talk to Mr. Dannenberger. I'm sorry. Dan, I have some questions for you. When you say omerta, are you talking about the mafia?
I think it's the same thing, because you can't, there's no information. There's no information on the number of rental houses in Lawrence. There is the map on the website, and there is, I don't know, something else.
Dan, it's our job to endure your invective.
That's right.
And you know what? Allegations of criminal activity cross the line. Do you have any evidence of criminal activity on the part of this commission?
Well, I don't know, but it
You don't know whether you have evidence or not? Do you have evidence, yes or no?
Well, one commissioner is spending time, or has spent time in jail, a former mayor. Now, what the other
On this
2
commission?
I don't know.
You don't know. So, in other words, you do not have evidence of criminal activity on the part of this commission?
I don't have any evidence.
Okay, so let me, you're a veteran commenter at these meetings. And I shouldn't have to give you any advice, but I'm going to anyway. If you don't have any evidence of criminal activity, then what you ought to be saying is, I believe that you all are breaking the law, or I think that you all are crooks.
Okay.
If you don't have evidence, then you need to qualify it with your thoughts or your beliefs, because that's all it is, Dan. All it is thoughts or beliefs. You have no proof. And as the longer you keep on talking about criminal activity on the part of this commission, without providing any proof or any evidence, the more singularly ineffective you appear.
Well, I don't care.
Well, I know. You don't care. We do. That's why we're here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. As far as I'm concerned, none of you are qualified to sit up there. And you should all resign so we could get a decent government.
Dan, there's an election. Go ahead and file.
Other public comment, Dan?
I will answer that. I'm not going to file to sit up there. I don't have the temperament for it, and I don't have the disposition for it. And I could not sit up there in good conscience, because nobody would want to listen to me sitting up there. We have just too much of
Thank you, Dan.
incompetence.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Commissioner Bowley. Appreciate that. Any other public comment on this item?
My name is Sarah Taliaferro. I live at 2145 New Hampshire Street. I'll try to gather my thoughts. I'm speaking only from myself, but my comments are perhaps informed by the work that I've been doing on affordable housing. So a couple comments, and if I run over time, I'll write these down and send them to you.
Thank you.
So, first comment, one of the things that Justice Affordable Housing Steering Committee did in doing research was to talk to Michael Anderson from the Centers of Community Change. And one of the points that he made to us is that it is indeed best practices to include folks who are working with federal funding that the city gets and the task force people. So actually having home and the oversight of AHAB, there might be some logistics to working that out, but that's actually a very wise idea in part because of it's also the body that's going to work to oversee leveraging. And pardon me, I might be a little rattled. I might kind of thrown off my focus. Another separate comment. This is something from back in the days when I served on the Mayor's Task Force on Homeless Services. HUD came up with a study 15 years or so ago that was talking about cities that are effective at kind of shifting, having a culture shift or changing what they're doing with homelessness and affordable housing. And so having local funds and not relying as much on federal funding allows them to be more adaptive. So again, kind of keeping an eye on how those federal, just what Shannon said, as those federal funds are shifting usually downward, it's good to kind of have an awareness of all that. Sorry, I am.
Maybe we can give her another minute or so. That was a hard act to follow.
I admit I was very focused and very
You're okay.
methodical. Okay. One exception, and these are just kind of responses to things that I was hearing or comments. The other exception to scattered housing as well, or in other words, reason to have people kind of in a conglomerate or in a concentrated area besides senior housing is any housing that includes supportive services. It allows for efficiencies.
Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead, Sarah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I may have to just submit them. Mr. Dannenberg brought up the fact of community impact of the university, and there are some positive examples, like in Ithaca, New York, where Cornell University actually is one of the partners working to put money into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So,
Okay.
yeah, thank you for your.
Yeah, if you want to submit anything, that's fine, you can. Thank you.
I just want to make a real quick correction. Thank you for bringing up the bus stop at the jail shelter. They do have a bus stop, but they don't have a shelter.
Shelter.
That's, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Any more public comment on this item?
Madam Mayor, Vice Mayor, Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement Association. And I'd like to comment on the affordable housing, on that survey that was done, that a lot of the renters were living in substandard housing. Now, we have a name in North Lawrence for those landlords, and they're slumlords. And the deal is, rental is a business. You make money off of it. You profit off of it. Or you don't do it like any other business. And so a couple examples I'll give you is North Lawrence is 75% owner occupied and 25% rental property. And even with that small amount of rental property, year or so, we had 2 properties, and we pay attention to rental property in our neighborhood. We had 2 properties that were definitely slumlord properties. And one had 2 families living in it. a family of 6, and downstairs had 2, and the rodents were so thick, and the roof was leaking, and sewage dripping down out of the second floor to the first floor. Got a hold of Brian Hernandez. He come over at 9 o'clock, and he condemned that building by noon. Then another hand, the landlord, the property owner, within 3 months, had that property repaired. And as soon as they repaired it, they turned around and sold it. And so then there was another property, a resident, and it was a little apartment deal, and some people bought it, and the residents were complaining, came to me, and complained about the standard of the condition of the building, of the house. And again, we called Brian, and Brian came over and took care of it. And personally, I don't think that this money should be used to subsidize this rental property, these businesses. They should be, you know, they're in it to make money. It's like any other business. I was in business for 30 years. You know, I was responsible for my building and everything else. So to spend this money into that and take it away from an individual that needs a weatherization or a roof or a furnace or something like that just because they run out of CDBG money, that's where it should be spent. And so, but anyway.
Thank you, Ted.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thanks.
that. Any other public comments? All right, bring it back up here. Any other final comments from anybody?
Thank you so much to the Affordable Housing Advisory Board for the work that you're doing. It's so important to our community, and we really appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. I echo that. Doing a lot of good work there. Anything else?
I think we're really done
We're
this
done?
time.
We're done. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Sass.
Never gonna live that down.